The construct of motherhood is something talked about all day in circles of women, in circles of education, in the media. And there's really a lot of tension around what it means to be a mom and the impacts of motherhood. I'm so tickled today to invite onto the show Amanda Montei, who has written an incredible book called Touched Out Motherhood, Misogyny, Consent and Control. And in it, she highlights so many different dimensions of our socio-political and gender-related power issues and how it affects motherhood. Amanda is also the author of a recent article in the New York Times, Can a Sexless Marriage Be a Happy One? And a previous piece in the New York Times called Mothers Want to Be Left Alone. I'm so excited to have Amanda here with me today. It's time to get naked with Dr. Kate. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Balestrieri, a Beverly Hills-based psychologist, certified sex therapist, and the founder of Modern Intimacy, a national therapy group. So let's dive into all things sex, relationships, mental health, and answer your questions with practical solutions and real answers. Each week, I'll share insights to help you build a healthy relationship with yourself, with other people, and with your sexuality. It's time to start thriving authentically. So let's get naked. And if you like this podcast, hit the download button so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to leave 5 stars and a review. Amanda, thanks so much for joining me today. I've been really looking forward to speaking with you because the concept of motherhood is out there in the media all day. People are talking about it whether they're mothers or not. And your book, Touched Out, has been the topic of conversation in a lot of circles for moms and for women. And I'd love to do a deep dive on what inspired you to write such a beautifully rich and contextual narrative of what mothers experience.
Oh, thank you for calling it that. Yeah, I'm so delighted to be here and talk with you. Um, you know, this book sort of evolved for me a little bit organically in the sense that I've always written about motherhood. I've always been curious about motherhood. My first book was a memoir, and it was with a smaller indie press, and I was so young when I wrote it, and I think what I was trying to understand was my own mother,
Mhm.
but also, how watching her shaped me, shaped what I understood about women, about what our place in the world was supposed to be, what we were not supposed to do as mothers. My house was fraught with addiction.
Mm.
Um, and so I had a loving mother, but she didn't always look like what a mother was supposed to look like. And so this was my book about my experience of motherhood. Or so I thought, right? I'm like I'm still moving through that.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, when I became a mother, I knew I needed to write through it.
Well, I'm so glad that you did because this new book, Touched Out, really does give a really dimensional view into just all of the individual experiences of motherhood, the nuances of it, and it shines a really interesting and necessary light into the contrast of what so many people expect motherhood to be about, and then what
Mm.
is their lived experience, because it can be a pretty jarring difference, right?
Yeah.
We expect that things will go easily and that everything will be intact in our relationship and our family life. And as you've highlighted, there are just so many other things to consider, and we don't really know until we know. So I'm
Right.
curious, when you became a mother, what were some of the most interesting surprises that you encountered?
Oh gosh, there's so many. And it surprises me every day, I think still. Um, moving through the experience of just being with two children who are their very own people. But I think, in terms of what I am tracking in this book and, what I experienced in early motherhood, I think I was surprised by how physical it was,
Mhm.
how bodily the experience was, and probably how disconnected I was from my own body.
During
Um,
that time or before?
Well, before and in early motherhood, I think I started to connect more deeply with my body. I was breastfeeding, and that was, like, as I write in the book, a really pleasurable experience for me. I know it's not always that way for anyone who feeds their own child from their body. It's a lot. It's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a intense experience. But I think that reconnected me to my body in a lot of ways. But there were also ways in which the work was so physical that overwhelmed me, which I also write about in the
Mm-hmm.
book. And I also write about addiction in the book. And that was certainly present in my life before I became a mother. And moving toward recovery was all happening
Mm-hmm.
in my early years of parenting. So yeah, the physicality of it, I think, surprised me. The lack of control that I felt over my life really surprised me, because I thought, well, I'm a feminist, I'm going to do this the right way. That proved difficult, more difficult than I expected. The lack of autonomy that I felt.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll also say, on sort of like the more positive track, the way in which motherhood just brought everything up. And that did lead me toward recovery, toward greater understanding of myself, which doesn't always happen, but that's where it led me. So,
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is one of the gifts of becoming a parent, right? If you're available and you have access to that information, right? Given you have the ability to actually tolerate it, and you can lean into it, you get a lot of information about how you were treated and how probably
yeah.
even your parents were treated, as you
Hmm.
start to recognize what you see when you look down and see these two little humans, or however many humans someone has
Hmm.
in their life. I mean, it really does give a lot of insight. So you decided to embark on a path of recovery. And what was that like for you when you were also parenting young ones?
Oh gosh, I mean, if I'm being honest, it was a mess. I mean, of course, right? That's
Yeah.
usually why we realize we need to make a change. But I didn't have like a rock bottom moment. I think, well, probably there's a lot of reasons for that. But as I mentioned, I grew up in a house where addiction shaped my childhood,
Hmm.
and so I knew that I wanted something different for my children. And I hesitate to talk about recovery as though it's just a choice we make, as though it's just that easy, to want something different. But it was really hard. It was really hard at first. And then ultimately, for me, being sober is a gift. It's expanded, my relationship with my children, with myself. It doesn't feel like a deprivation. So while it was definitely messy in the beginning, that's the place that I
Mm.
moved toward with it. Yeah.
Yeah. I've worked with a lot of moms who are in their early parenting years, with kids between, I'll say, newborn and six, who are also struggling to get sober or trying to find a relationship with their substance or addiction, that is manageable for them. And I think one of the things that I hear a lot is how trapped they feel in
Yeah.
a life that is so governed by their addiction and also
Mhm.
governed by the demands of parenting, and
Yeah.
juggling that nuance between, I need an escape or something that's just for me because parenting is so taxing and demanding, and
Hmm.
I know I want to stay sober because I want to be there for my kids in this way that I know will be more meaningful for them. And I'm really curious if you experienced any of that tension and what you might say to moms who are going through that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I've written about this, in terms of mommy wine culture and the way in which we really normalize that suffering that
Mhm.
so many parents and so many women in particular experience, in response to the pressure to be everything to the child, physically, emotionally, and then to turn to alcohol as a release. There's also a long history of sort of framing, alcohol as a sort of revolutionary, radical act for women who feel, as you said, trapped or under the thumb of, misogyny and patriarchal control. So, and I write about this in Touched Out as well, the way in which we just kind of come to see the maternal experience through that sort of cultural lens as one that is naturally terrible and painful and disorienting and confining,
Mm.
rather than acknowledge that people are really suffering
Yeah.
in response to systemic and cultural forces. So I think for me, it's important to resist that trope of the sort of
Mhm.
suffering mom, and that it's a joke, and that it's funny that so many are feeling so trapped that they have to turn to substances or whatever to sort of release the valve.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an important thing to give credence to. If you're somebody listening and you're feeling that pressure of being trapped in the role, 'cause it isn't easy to see how to get out of some of the pressure of that sometimes. We just don't have a lot of resources and a lot
Mhm.
of strong support in our culture for moms or parents in general.
Yeah.
So, especially single parents, they are really doing the most, and they don't have the ability to lean on a co-parent, as readily as two parents who are doing this together.
Right.
In theory.
Absolutely. Right. And one of the things I talk about in Touched Out is the way that we sort of weaponize the idea of choice in our
Mhm.
culture, especially against parents. This idea that, well, you chose this. And so
Mhm.
if you're struggling, well, that's because you've made some sort of mistake. If you're poor, that's your fault. If you're single, you've made some sort of, error. And it's really damaging, and it also really shuts down our ability to understand how autonomy and choice are always conditioned along the lines of race and class and gender. We all have a different ability to access choice in our lives, and that's something that I sort of unpack in the book. Yeah.
Well, let's get to the title of your book, Touched Out. I love the title for so many reasons. It's super evocative. And it's also something that I think when you're a parent, you just get, especially if you've been the primary parent. So, how would you define being touched out? And let's talk about how this really affects mothers
Yeah.
and and their relationships and their identity.
Well, I'll start with sort of the cultural definition of the term, and then some of the ways that I wanted to kind of dig in and investigate what might be hiding underneath that term in my book. When we talk about feeling touched out as mothers, it is often this feeling that's described as, wanting to pull off your skin. You have the narratives of women hiding in bathrooms, just to get a minute of personal space, or,
Mhm.
taking a shower alone is like self-care. So there's this idea that as a parent, but specifically, as a mother, we don't have any personal space. And usually in those narratives, children are sort of framed as the ones who are grabbing,
Mhm.
touching, pulling, yanking. And there is a certain degree of filth and touch, that is inherent to caring for anyone, caring for
Mhm.
a child or anyone who needs caregiving. And I write in the book about working as a nanny, but also as
Mhm.
in a daycare.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of touch.
Mm.
But one of the things that I was interested in, as a writer, is sort of, well, what's underneath this? The way that we normalize that, as we
Mhm.
were talking about earlier,
Mhm.
the way that we normalize usually the image of one woman in a heterosexual marriage at home alone, taking
Mhm.
care of the children, and there's no one else around, and the kids are just clawing at her, and so that was curious to me. This is
Mhm.
obviously a culturally, historically specific image. And then I also noticed that in a lot of these narratives, women were talking about feeling like the kids had been on her all day. And then there's a male partner who comes home, and, either the wife feels she's letting him down because she's not sexually
Mhm.
available, or really doesn't want to have anything to do with him at all.
Mhm.
And so there was this curious relationship between sex, marriage, heterosexuality, and parenting that I wanted to unpack.
Yeah, and that you did. I mean, it is a really insightful conversation because I think what I'm hearing is that you've really honed in on the word that comes to mind is access, right?
Mhm,
Like
mhm,
children want access to their parents, and that
mhm.
shows up in all different kinds of forms. And children benefit from having access to their parents.
Of course.
And also, parents need some space and some time to not be in parent mode and to not be climbed on and have dirt on their on their clothes and their face and all the things that come with the joys of parenting. But for women, I think in particular, what I'm hearing you hone in on is this expectation of access that a lot of women have experienced men feeling for them throughout their lives. And I don't know about you, but in my work, the women that I've talked to have talked about being objectified by men as
Mhm.
early as when they were an infant
Yeah.
all the way up through their adulthood.
Mm,
But most of them receiving a pretty stark drop off in that kind of direct objectification somewhere in their 30s. But most of them talk about their first experiences of being sexually objectified in grade school, in middle
oh,
school.
yeah.
And
Mhm.
so this idea that people want access to you all the time, I think really does sink into our mind and into the cultural expectation of how we exist in our bodies and how
Mhm.
people relate to us in their bodies. So when a partner comes home and he's been waiting to see her and engage with her all day, that's one more person that wants access to her. And that
Yeah.
experience of feeling so touched out may not be because her partner is engaging in entitlement or doing anything offensive, but it
Mhm.
can bring up a lot of these long-standing, I'll say, ambivalences about sex because of all of that demand on the body.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes to all of that. Yeah. And I love the word access. Another term that I've been thinking about lately is availability, which, is very similar. And I think part of what I am trying to track and trace and connect in the book is exactly what you've described, that from a young age, those of us who are socialized as girls,
Mm,
we do often feel that need to be sexually available, enticing, to perform our objectification and to filter all of our desires through that.
mhm,
And then to come of age and become a mother and to experience a lot of that similarly, and to experience that in marriage, in heterosexual marriage, it can be very confusing. It can be very disorienting. And what I've heard from a lot of readers of the book is like, I knew all of this was connected, but I didn't
mhm.
quite know how to talk about how it was connected. And I think it was the same for me, and I wanted to write toward that.
When you and I were prepping for this interview, we talked a little bit about being relationally touched out too,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
sort of the emotional demands that are often placed on women and people socialized as girls when they're younger. I think, can we speak a little bit to that? The emotional labor and the expectations and how that contributes to that feeling of being touched out?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I mean, I think that when we think of this cultural term touched out, I think it is often, at least on the surface, defined as this sort of physical overtouch.
Mhm,
And again, it's usually connected to the kids. But as I see it, what we're talking about, this term, feeling touched out, is an umbrella for all these other cultural issues that you and I are discussing.
mhm,
It's not just kids' grabby hands. It is also the way that we feel overtouched by all these ideas, all this ideology.
mhm,
Just using motherhood as an example, how my face needs to be when my kid's having a tantrum, or how I'm looked at school pickup, and these are small, minor, which I don't mean to, dismiss them or trivialize
mhm,
them, but there's so many ways in which we feel eyed and ogled, and also that we internalize all these, you need to do this, you need to do that to be a
mhm,
good woman, to be a good wife, to be a good mom, to be a good girl. And a lot of that can make us feel a
mhm,
kind of sensory overload on top of the physicality and what we were talking about in terms of availability and access, desire to please. And then, you mentioned the term emotional labor.
mhm,
And I think that of course plays into the sheer volume of labor that, women are expected to take on in the home, that too becomes a source of sensory psychological overload.
hmm Summer for me is always a time of resetting my wellness practices. So that means working out, eating healthier, using lots of sunscreen. It also means taking care of my microbiome. So whether you're off to the pool, hiking, or traveling this summer, you're bringing your microbiome with you. The 38 trillion bacteria that live in and on you, especially in your gut, are essential to whole body health. Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic is a 24 strain probiotic and prebiotic that benefits your gut, skin, and heart health in just 2 capsules a day. I love taking Seed because it's a really convenient way for me to make sure that I'm taking care of my insides as much as my outsides. Only 2 capsules a day makes it really easy for me to fit this into my daily routine. Seed's patented capsule and capsule design means all 24 strains of bacteria survive the journey, from shipping to your door through digestion, without synthetic or chemical coatings. No refrigeration is needed. Seed goes the extra mile by testing their probiotics in Chyme, the closest system developed to model human digestion and the gut, to ensure 100% of the dose is delivered where it needs to go. With clinical trials and breakthrough research published in top scientific journals, Seed's probiotic research and development make DS-01 a product you know you can trust. So support your gut this summer with Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic. Go to seed.com/getnaked and use code 25GetNaked to get 25% off your first month. That's 25% off your first month of Seed's DS-01 Daily Symbiotic.com/getnaked, code 25GetNaked. I think I remember in your book you were talking about either it was your relationship or you were talking about someone else's relationship. I can't remember, but the example that you gave was how you had to spend copious amounts of time explaining away all of the feelings that you were having and breaking down these big, big, big abstract ideas into little small, easily metabolized sound bites for your partner to
Yeah,
explain to him why being sexual wasn't something that you were interested in that moment.
right.
And I love the way you honed in on it and you said it was something along the lines of like even like describing what I'm feeling or saying no has become like this incredible burden of labor because men often are not socialized to understand the experience of relationships and emotions the same way that women are. I wonder if you can say a little more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, of course, in any relationship, there is what we might call emotional labor. And I don't personally use that term too much because I think it's become so used that it sometimes loses meaning,
Mhm.
But I think that moment that you're describing, it is that difficulty of being in relationship with someone who has been socialized differently, And I think when you're already struggling, and I've noticed this in a lot of women that I've spoken to
Mhm.
for I know we'll talk about this for a piece that I wrote recently, when we're already trying to figure out what the heck is going on with ourselves and our
Mhm.
bodies, it can feel like this huge laborious task to break that down for a partner,
Mhm.
which is not to say that we shouldn't do that we shouldn't have those conversations. But as you mentioned, there's a gendered element there to how we talk about emotions, how we connect when those things are happening, who's reading all the books and doing all the work of kind of breaking things down.
Yes.
There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack there.
Well, and part of the difference in gender related socialization is also an expectation on who is the authority. And
Yeah.
what I really appreciated in the example you gave in your book was how you mentioned that your partner was listening, but you could tell by the expression on his face he didn't quite buy what you were saying. I think that's a frustrating part that a lot of women run into because when we're talking about heterosexual relationships, we do have different bodies and different hormonal experiences. And what you just described in sort of having to go through something that is so big, but also so invisible to the
Mm-hmm.
outside looker, things like you're changing hormones or feeling uncomfortable in your own skin as your body is changing or the demands of your day. All those
Mhm.
things are hard to really pinpoint, especially to someone who can't see the inner workings of your emotional experience because they're not you, regardless of gender. But then factor in this sort of credibility gap, if you will. And
Mm,
a lot of people who are socialized as men really don't understand how to sort of not center their own skepticism, right?
mm,
In trying to fact find with their partner. It becomes a me versus you instead of a hey, we're exploring this together. So I hear from a lot of the women that I work with that they're feeling frustrated because their partners aren't doing as much of the research. They're not pulling in as much effort to try to get to a collaborative resolution. And if that is the case for longer periods of time, even that can become another example of how feeling touched out can be so exacerbated, right? In putting forth all that additional labor.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think when you layer that on, issues that we often run into in heterosexual relationships for new parents, the division of labor in the household. And who's doing the work to just even in the best of cases to figure out how
Mm,
things are going to be equitably divided. So new parenthood can bring on just like layers of if we want to call it emotional labor, or I prefer the term like just upheaval, confusion, like
mm,
how are we going to make this home run, how are we going to do so equitably. Again, this is in the best
mm.
case when both partners want that.
Yeah.
How are we going to work out our new relationships with our bodies and our identities and our professional lives, which are also being impacted by,
Mhm.
gendered policies, in terms of what happens to our career after we have a child. So there's just a lot of upheaval that happens, and all of it is bringing to the surface gender and power.
Mhm.
And so I just hope that this book provides some new narrative, some new connections, some new ways of understanding some of that upheaval.
Mhm. Has your partner read your book?
Yes, definitely.
How did
Yes.
that go?
Oh, fine. I mean, he, yeah, has always been very supportive
Mhm.
of my work.
Yeah, what I mean when I ask that question is, did he come away with any new insights? Is it your book is a book that I've recommended to many of my male clients whose wives have recently become mothers and they're struggling to understand her experience and they've come back and said, wow, I didn't get all the granular stuff. And it's easier for them to hear from someone who isn't their partner because it doesn't feel like then they're in some sort of power struggle, or it doesn't feel like it's so attached to the me and you of it all. It's easier to hear
Yes.
from someone outside of their own relationship. So I'm curious, what insights, if any, did he walk away with?
I don't talk about him too much when I talk about the book, just because that is a rule that I have for myself as a woman author.
Yes.
But I will say that, yes, he learns from everything that I write, first of all. But that I have also heard from so many readers who have shared the book with their male partners.
Mhm.
And that was really surprising to me because as a woman author, as a feminist, when I sit down to write, I have an audience in mind,
Mhm.
and it isn't usually straight cis hetero men.
Mhm.
And I sort of, I think, assumed that they just wouldn't, and I've been really um, amazed and grateful to hear about how the book has been used as sort of a conversation
Mhm.
starter
Mhm.
in relationships, and how many women have told me, I gave this to my partner. And that it was a very surprising part of putting the book into the world.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's great.
Mhm.
I think it's important for male partners to understand how complex that upheaval, as I mentioned, that transition can be for their partners. And of course, incredibly complex for male partners as well.
It is, and I think and I appreciate you saying that you don't typically talk about your husband as a feminist author, as a woman author,
Mhm.
and I don't want to usurp your opinion with his. I bring that up because a lot of my listeners are men, and they are
Yeah.
men who are partnered with women. And a lot of the people that I work with are like, I want to understand more. I want
Yeah.
deeper learning. Please point the way. And I think it can be
Yeah.
helpful for men to understand what other men have learned and gleaned from the perspective of their
Yeah.
female
Totally.
partners. Um, but we do often, as a society, reduce men and their role in parenting to this kind of like bumbling, ineffective,
Yeah.
uninterested dude, man child. And that's really unfair for a lot of partners who really do care and want want to learn more and who are involved and who recognize their own dimensionality.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that the cultural trope of the,
Hmm.
incompetent dad is not serving anyone.
No.
And I think that there's actually, now you're sort of inspiring me to write another piece, that there's overlap there between the way that we normalize the suffering of
Mhm.
mothers, and then we normalize this kind of image of like the dad who's not helping. And I'll say, I recently wrote a piece for a New York Times Magazine on marital sex, and something that surprised me about the research that I did for that piece as well was how engaged and earnestly these male partners that I spoke with were trying to understand what is marital sex today. And when you bring consent into marital sex, which is new historically, what happens and how do you honor boundaries and space and the different needs of your partner while also having your own subjectivity. So I think that was really eye-opening for me to just see how much empathy the
Mhm.
men that I spoke with had for their partners.
Mhm.
And I'd love to see more of that, more conversation around that.
I would too. And I would love to see those men doing more community with other men to help bring them into
Yeah.
that fold because
Yeah.
unfortunately some of the loudest voices on social media and out there in the world are the men who I think really want connection but don't know how to cultivate that, and so they come across in a very entitled and very reductionistic way in their relationships, which
Right.
makes them people that often women don't want to be around, unfortunately. So, yeah, I would love to see men engaging in more conversation with other men and sort of how to lead the way toward an empathic
Yeah.
approach to being in a relationship with other men and with women and people in general. But
Right.
let's talk about your New York Times piece. You had a really beautiful piece a couple of it was a month ago now,
I guess so.
a month or
Yes.
so ago.
Where are we in time?
Yes. And I forget the exact title, but it was something along the lines of "Can a sexless marriage be a healthy marriage?" or something along that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. How did you feel inspired to write that piece and what did you learn?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that piece, grew out of my curiosity about what is marital sex today, given that we now live in a culture that, is still very much fraught by gender relations and
Mhm.
misogyny, but that is a lot more articulate about consent.
Mhm.
And as I mentioned, just a moment ago, like the history of consent in marriage is relatively
Yeah.
new. And I think we often forget that. Spousal rape was not outlawed nationwide until the early 90s in the
Mhm.
US, which is pretty recent. Even the sexual revolution was not that long ago. So I was really curious to understand, how does consent work in marriage, in this institution that has for so long been ruled by, male entitlement and these ideas around sexual obligation.
Mhm.
And it was really, I mean, just fascinating and eye-opening to talk with so many people. So for the piece,
Mhm.
I talked to almost 40 people in
No.
heterosexual relationships. And there is definitely still, I would say pretty much every woman that I spoke to still lived with this feeling of obligation, of sexual
Mhm.
obligation, of duty, even though so many of them were sort of pushing back against it.
Mhm.
It was just this thing that they sort of had absorbed culturally.
Yeah.
However, yeah, a lot of the couples that I talked to were trying to understand their sexual lives differently. Some of them had been parents, some not. And, whether there was medical issues or parenting had sort of changed things, relationships are long and things change, and sexual lives change, desires change.
Mhm.
And so I was kind of interested in seeing how does that play out? What happens?
And what did you learn?
Well, I learned that desire is complex, as of course you know. Talking about desire with your partner is hard. So many of the couples that I spoke to, it was like a pressure valve had been released because they didn't really talk about these things with other people. Sometimes they talk to each other, but not always. And as I mentioned, I realized, or found, that a lot of these couples were navigating these very
Mhm.
thorny questions around obligation and duty and whose desires, were sort of being given primacy in the relationship.
Mhm.
And what happens when a woman in particular just doesn't want to have sex
Mhm.
for any period of time? Also, I'll say too that all of the couples were totally overscheduled, exhausted,
Mhm.
burnt out. So they're trying to have these conversations about big questions about the institution of marriage, gender relations, their own complex desires,
Mhm.
traumas sometimes,
Mhm.
just basic what brings me pleasure, how does my body work now,
Yeah.
in between really busy lives.
Well, and that burnout plays a big role too. If you
Yeah,
are so overscheduled because you're living in a world that it's hard to survive in, right? And you're
right.
just trying to make ends meet and get through one event to another, that takes a huge toll on desire. And it's hard to even get an appropriate baseline of what your desire is until some of those variables are accounted for. But
Right.
interestingly, I wonder if you ran across this study in your research for the article. I just saw an article that talked about heterosexual relationships and desire and whether or not people saw sex as a right or an obligation versus something they
Mm-hmm.
truly desired. And what
Mm-hmm.
was interesting in the data, it talked about how a greater adherence to traditional gender roles
Mm-hmm.
typically meant for both men and women less desire, but it meant more sex. And when
Mm-hmm.
they queried why with the men and the women involved in the study, the men often believed that it was a part of their right as men, a part of their duty in the performance of their masculinity to
Yeah.
desire sex. And
Yeah.
so a lot of it was in service of, reestablishing a sense of precariousness with their masculinity over and over again. And they
Mm-hmm.
didn't really desire the sex they were having. And similarly, the higher gender role adherence for women meant a greater sense of duty, right? So
Yeah.
women provide pleasure and men receive pleasure in this
Mm,
sort of gendered dynamic when we're talking about heterosexual relationships and power. And it
yeah.
was, I mean, it's not surprising for folks like you and me who are eyeballs deep in this research all day, but I
Right.
think a lot of people, when they really start unpacking sort of the relationship between gender and power, it can be really confusing and overwhelming. And I think it brings up a lot of grief for people of all genders. And I'm curious, how have you navigated grief in your writing about this topic? Has it come up for you, either with yourself or the people that you've interviewed, as they're
Mm.
reconciling and maybe a reality of what is compared to what they thought life would look like?
I mean, I love that question. I love just your emphasis on this idea of grief,
Mhm,
um, because I think we've emphasized anger and rage
mhm,
and hope, and we've tried it all. We've tried all the feelings. And I think grief is really important. I think it's really important to honor what it feels like to come of age, whatever age, to move into a phase of life when you realize I wanted that thing, or I thought I wanted that thing,
Mhm.
and then I got that thing and it was very different from what I expected.
Yeah.
Or, wow, I didn't realize I carried all of these ideas about
Mhm.
men, about women, about myself, about sex, about heterosexuality, about desire, and to realize that some of those things were fantasy, not in a good way,
Right.
or damaging to us,
Mhm.
hurtful to us. And so I love the idea of acknowledging, even when we talk about the idea of feeling touched out, that there's grief under there, that there's loss. And I have certainly noticed that in my own life of
Mhm.
becoming a mother. And, I mentioned being a feminist and thinking I was going to do it the right way, grieving that idea, but also coming into a different understanding of
Mhm.
what motherhood is. I grieve the loss of my children to a patriarchal culture,
Mhm.
at the same time, spending every day trying to safeguard them against, ideas that would limit the way that they think about their own bodies, their own sexuality, their
Mhm.
gender, someday. So I think there is a lot of grief and mourning
Yeah.
in those experiences. There's definitely a lot of mourning in motherhood, which I write about in Touched Out.
Mhm.
And I think in the people that I spoke to for the piece for Times Magazine too, there was often a lot of sadness and grief around, losing connection to themselves sexually for whatever reason that was happening,
Mhm.
which I think is perhaps why it felt so good for some of them to talk it out, why they were actually willing to talk to me.
Well, a lot of people get scared to start that conversation with themselves or with their partner and with another person because when you do start opening up those doors, sometimes you can't unring the bell. And I
Yeah,
think it
definitely.
begets a series of questions about what are my options and what am I doing. So sometimes the safest thing for people is to not ask themselves these questions or talk about it. But
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
does, continue sort of the stagnation, right?
Yeah,
And I'm a big proponent of having to move through the grief so you can get to the pleasure because
yeah,
unfortunately when we numb out the grief, we don't get to feel the good stuff either.
totally agree.
Yeah.
Yes. I think there is pleasure on the other side of looking at some of this
Mhm.
um, in the face, even though it is challenging, rage inducing, grief inducing at times, or could even cause disconnection with, between you and your partner.
Mhm.
But I do think there's pleasure on the other side. And it's so interesting that mentioned that. I think my work now, I am thinking a lot about once you realize that there's all this stuff on you,
Yeah.
ideas, and you push it all away as the image of the touched out person goes, then what?
Yeah.
Right? How do you start to fill back in with things that bring you pleasure, acknowledging that our sense of desire and pleasure is sort of always a priori filtered through culture and politics.
Mhm.
But so I'm thinking a lot about pleasure now, as I know you are.
Yes, always.
Mhm.
What can we expect from you next? Are you working on anything new?
Yeah, I'm working on some tiny things that are just in the works, and I'm looking toward my next book, which I hope will be more about pleasure. I'm also doing some research on women in homes. I'm very interested in that connection, how our idea of home sort of structures how we think about women, gender.
Mhm.
And I'm always writing my newsletter, weekly things, weekly thoughts.
Yes, your newsletter is one of my favorites. So can you name it and where else can people find you if they want to connect with you or your work?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the newsletter is Mad Woman.
Mm.
It's at Substack. It's myname.substack.com, I believe.
Mhm.
My first and last name. You can find me online at Amonti at Instagram on Instagram.
Mhm.
And that's pretty much all I do for social media now.
Okay.
And I'm always teaching, but I'm going into a nice long summer break of writing.
Oh,
So
well, I
yeah,
hope you indulge with all kinds of pleasure and
yeah.
joy and peace and rest. And thank you so much for coming here today and talking with us about your book.
You too. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for listening. I'll catch you next week. Thank you for listening to Get Naked with Dr. Kate. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Kate Balestrieri and on YouTube at Modern Intimacy. If you have questions you want answered on the podcast, feel free to email me at question@getnakedpodcast.com. Our Modern Intimacy team is here to help you and to provide you with support. Feel free to schedule a free 30-minute consultation at the link in our show notes. And don't forget to join our newsletter for insights, surveys, and articles sent directly to your inbox. You can sign up at modernintimacy.com/newsletter. New episodes drop every Tuesday. I'll see you next week. Disclaimer, this podcast is not a substitute for therapy and does not constitute a professional relationship with me, Dr. Kate, or with Modern Intimacy. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only.